Hello, welcome to the astronomy segment of My Week at the Club. Today's topic was sort of inspired by a big storm we had yesterday. We had a nor'easter and lots of wind was blowing. And I got to remembering something that basically an experimental result that we got, about 20 years or so ago, 15 or 20 years, no, 25 or 30 years ago. Time flies. 25 or 30 years ago in VLBI. So this was back in the early 90s when there were some GPS satellites, but the Department of Defense was still encoding the signals from the GPS satellites, so you couldn't really do any kind of precision geodesy. Couldn't find positions on the Earth if you were a scientific investigator using GPS. But we did have VLBI, which actually did and still does a much better job for accuracy. It's just not as convenient. And with very long baseline interferometry, of course, you can do things like image black holes, as we saw a few weeks ago, but you can work the other way around. And in this cartoon here, showing signals coming from a quasar, typically the signals come and wash over one antenna first, and then continue to travel at the speed of light, and then wash over other antennas on the surface of the Earth. And by measuring very accurately the time delay between the times that the signal arrives at the different antennas, you can figure out very precisely where those antennas are in relation to that distant quasar in space. And so we've used this to make our real-time measurement of the crustal plates moving on the Earth back in the 80s. And in the 90s, it was used for a different purpose. Here you can see some VLBI measurements of something called the length of day. So the Earth is spinning, and it's spinning quite rapidly. It's about 500 meters per second at the equator, 450, something like that. And during the course of the day, of course, we travel all the way around the Earth. If you can measure the position of a place on the Earth very accurately with respect to the stars, then you can tell just how much the Earth has spun at any given point in time. And we can figure out what the length of a day is. And it turns out that that day varies by quite a bit. So in this plot here, it's the vertical scale is in microseconds. So it's in thousands, 500 units of 500 microseconds are the main hash marks. But 1,000 microseconds, of course, is a millisecond of time, one thousandth of a second. And the Earth travels about half a meter or so in a half a second. And we can measure positions using VLBI to about a centimeter. So we can split that half a meter down quite finely. So we can do much better than a millisecond of time in figuring out how much the Earth is rotated and therefore how long the day is. And if you plot it over several years, you actually see that the length of day is varying quite a bit over those years. And there's a large annual signature, as you can see here in the blue curve, plus some higher frequency noise or variation that's going on. And the question is, what's causing this? Well, the people quickly came up with the idea that, the Earth is isolated in space, and unless it's being acted on by external bodies, angular momentum is going to be conserved. So it can't be that the Earth is speeding up and slowing down on its own. There has to be some part of it that's speeding up and slowing down in relation to the rest of it. And the theory was put forward that, maybe it's the winds, because the winds blow harder on some days and not so hard on the other days. And mainly here we're talking about larger, not stormy winds like we had yesterday, but we're really talking about more of the bulk winds that, the easterlies that blow continuously in a constant direction and have all the mass of the atmosphere behind them, and also the jet streams. And those vary seasonally as the weather changes. And the question is, could those really account for what we saw in the VLBI data? Well, what people did was to go out and get the atmospheric models that weather forecasters have for the atmosphere over the whole Earth. And they have, the density of the air is one of the parameters that they have, and they also have the bulk wind motions. They know how the wind is blowing in different places. And you can take all of the all that information and figure out how much momentum there is in the blowing of the winds. And when they speed up and slow down, the momentum increases and decreases. It's actually angular momentum because it's all going around, spinning around the axis of the Earth. And the question is, how does that angular momentum compare with what we measured or inferred what the changes in angular momentum are using the VLBI data, using length of day data from VLBI. And as you can see here, in the red curve is plotted the total atmospheric angular momentum using those models. And you can compare it to the blue curve, which is the VLBI data. And it turns out the agreement is excellent. They're very highly correlated. And there are a few other effects that are going on, but this is the predominant cause of that variation on timescales from weeks to a few years in the angular orientation of the Earth and how it's spun, how the length of day is changing. So I found it interesting. It's a little historical now. It's old research, but still kind of fun to look at. So on to the chess. Hello again, chess fans. This week I played a game at the club in the second round of the Ernest Fandreyer Memorial against Mike Commisso. And I played Mike probably a dozen times, and 3/4 or 80% of those I've had white. And following the pattern, on Wednesday I had white once again. And I opened up in a king pawn opening, and Mike went into a Sicilian defense. And as threatened, I considered going into an open Sicilian, as threatened in my last video, but decided not to, instead transposing into an offshoot of the Alapin variation in the Sicilian, with the idea that maybe the bishop will develop through d3 in this case. But Mike handled this very well. He immediately struck back at the center. And, in this position where he's played his knight to c6, developed there, this doesn't work as well as it does this idea of if the first move had been just pawn to d6. And the reason is exactly what Mike is showing, is that he can go all the way to d5 with the pawn in one gulp. And I have to do something about this counterattack. I really didn't like any of my options. I could exchange the pawns, but I didn't want to invite his queen into the center of the board because I didn't have any easy way to attack it. Normally if the queen is here on d5, then playing knight out to c3 is an easy way to gain a tempo on the queen. But that doesn't work here. So instead, I went ahead and pushed the pawn, realizing that it might be weak on e5. And knowing that he had a couple of interesting opportunities here. One is that he could go ahead and pin my knight with his bishop, and I think that would have been quite a reasonable move for him. Another possibility would have been to push this d-pawn to d4. And I looked at that for quite a while, so here's the line I was looking at in my head. What I thought I would do, rather than immediately taking that pawn, is to play my bishop to c4 and go for quick development. And now that more or less prevents him, or it does prevent him really, from playing bishop to g4, because that would be a mistake. I could just sack my bishop on f7. Well, it's excuse me. It's not really a sack, of course. It's just a little combination where I can come up with a check and have a discovered attack and win the bishop with my queen. So ending up, a pawn to the good on the on this trade, and with quite a good attacking position here. So he did not do that. Instead, he after I played e5, he actually played e6, which transposes into a advanced variation of the French defense, except it's sort of a funny one, or at least not the absolute main line, where white has developed his king's knight through f3. So the advanced French normally ends up with that knight coming through e2, or at least often to e2, and then on to c3, and the other knight crisscrossing over to f3. So that's not going to happen here, obviously, because my knight's already committed to f3. But other than that, it's a fairly normal looking advanced French. So I went ahead and played d4. He exchanged off the pawns, and then surprised me by immediately counterattacking my center with f6. So this is a common theme in the French defense. But I felt like this was premature here, and I was kind of happy to see it. So I went ahead and put my bishop on the this diagonal that's always so strong in the French defense, or for white against the French defense, looking at black's kingside, assuming the castle's over there. And Mike attacked my bishop with knight to b4. Now, I think I responded to this probably not in the best possible way. What I did do was to just play my bishop back to e2 and say to Mike, what are you going to do with that knight? But probably a better thing here would have been to just go ahead and castle. So if white castles, black really has nothing better to do than to go ahead and take the knight. But that develops my queen now. And if you look at what's happening here, white's getting a big lead in development. And black's kingside is a little bit compromised with this f-pawn having moved, so he's weak on the white squares. So this is actually quite a nice position, I think, for white to get into, and it's what I probably should have done. But after knight to b4, instead I backed off my bishop and metaphorically said to him, what are you going to do with that knight? And what he decided to do was to move back. And now we're in the same position we were in 2 moves ago, right here, except that my bishop now, instead of being on f1, is on e2. E2, and it's with white to move in both cases. So basically I've gotten a free move moving my bishop to e2. Not the best square. I still think d3 is a better square, but a free tempo like that in the opening, particularly when you're white, is a good thing. So I can immediately castle in that case. He exchanged on e5. I took back with the knight and then back with the pawn, thinking that I could make him uncomfortable on all these weak light squares around his king. And I think maybe I could have, but not the way I played it. Okay, so he got on with his development knight to e7, and I had this idea in my mind that for some reason that he was going to move his knight next so they could get his bishop out. I figured either the knight was going to come to here to g6, or maybe he was going to come here to f5. And in either case, a bishop on d3 really puts a cramp into that plan. But that's not what he had in mind. So what he did do was to play simply g6. So a better thing back in this position, instead of moving my bishop yet again, was to make use. This throws away a tempo, playing bishop back to e3, and I'm better off just getting another piece into the attack here with bishop to g5. And now that knight's not going to move, and I'm able to continue on to press on those weak light squares on the king side. So I like this idea better, but I did not play it. Instead, I went to d3, and he played g6, shutting down my immediate attacking ideas there on the king side, and giving his bishop a way to attack my e-pawn on the very next move. I played knight c3. He played a6. This is because I have ideas of playing knight g5 to d6 here, which is a strong square. I would have to have taken time out to support my e-pawn after he attacked it, but the a6 stops that. But again, that's not serving to help his development at all. And here I made a sort of a dubious maneuver. I brought my knight back to e2 because I want to get it into this, not that square, this d4 square, where it's, very strong outpost. It's shielded by his pawn. It can't be attacked by his pawns at all. So that was my idea of playing my knight to e2, but a better move here at this point would once again be to play the bishop out to g5. And I examined this move, but I only looked at it insofar as after he played bishop to g7, I was thinking about the inferior move bishop to f6, which I decided, I think correctly, is no good because he just trades off. And now this f-pawn is very weak. He can move the knight somewhere, say to f5, and this pawn is going to die. And about the best it can do is to sacrifice itself and get the king to move, but that's not that convincing to me. But instead, the good continuation here after playing bishop to g5, if he plays bishop to g7, would have been to just come out with the queen to a4 check. Okay, he blocks with something, probably the bishop. Could block with the queen too, or even his b pawn could come up. But then I do the second part of the maneuver to bring the queen over to h4, and that prevents his castling because this knight is attacked twice now, and I've got a bit of a bind on the position. So, you know, this would have been an interesting way to play. I probably didn't consider it because it didn't defend my e-pawn, but, you know, that's really irrelevant here because if he takes that e-pawn, he's in for a world of hurt, right? So I can gain a tempo attacking it with my rook and getting my rook on the open e-file, bring my other rook into the attack, and now, you know, he can't castle. What's he going to do? A logical move might be to play rook c8, but I'm already in a position here where I can just snarf off the d-pawn because he can't take back because of the triple attack on that. You know, now the rook is attacking through that pawn, attacking the knight on e7, and rook takes knight check would be a horrible move for black. So he couldn't take that pawn, and instead he'd have to be content with some other move here, and this is looking pretty grim for black. I didn't do that. Instead I remaneuvered my knight, but this gives him time now to attack my pawn. I defend it, and he gets the castle. And now all of a sudden he's getting a pretty strong square here on f5 because he has two pawns, a rook, a knight, and a bishop all bearing down on it. Okay, so I continue on. Since I've opened up this diagonal, my king rather is exposed to checks along the open diagonal, so I played it to h1. He developed his bishop, makes sense. I went ahead and put my knight on that strong square that I was aiming toward, and he challenged it immediately with his knight. And this doesn't work out too well for him because I actually have a good answer, which is to take it off with my bishop, trade my bishop for it. My knight is so good, I want to keep that knight that's on d4. And so instead I trade off his knight with my bishop, and now this knight here, you can see how powerfully posted that knight is on d4. It's going to be a thorn in his side. Okay, let's scroll up a little bit here for you. So after he recaptured, I went ahead and developed my bishop to a reasonable diagonal. I also considered going to d2. He got his queen off the back rank, connected his rooks. I tried to grab the c-file, and he resisted it with his f-rook, which is probably the right one to use here, because the other rook will be useful in supporting the a and b pawns. So I played queen to f3 here. Stockfish likes this okay. It liked queen to b3 a little better. But in either way, the important thing is that I'm attacking this undefended pawn on d5, which would fall a check. So he has to do something about that. And he supports it with his bishop. Okay, well, now this gives me time to gang up on that bishop on the c-file and to create some weaknesses. So I played rook c3. He, of course, saw what was coming here, and so he started to double on the c-file as well. I completed the doubling. He completed his doubling to defend on c6. And now I actually have quite a good position, but I managed to really screw it up here by making a very bad move that dropped the evaluation from, what is it, plus 3.6 down to minus 1.5. So from a winning advantage for white to a very bad or nearly losing disadvantage for white. But what I should have done, and I actually considered it, was to play knight takes bishop immediately. And he would retake with the b pawn. And, well, actually, I should point out, he has to really retake with the b pawn. If he takes with the rook, right, then I can just play queen takes pawn check. That's really no good for him. So he takes with the b pawn instead. But now he has this really weak pawn on c6, and it's only defended by those two rooks, and I can immediately chase one of the rooks away. And if he goes to b7, I can take that pawn with my rook, and he can trade off if he wants, but either way, he could attack my rook, I could defend it with my queen. I mean, it's a good position for white. And I looked at this, but somehow I didn't evaluate it quite correctly, and instead I said, I'll be cleverer. Instead of going in for this immediate play on a c file, I decided to move my knight out of the way with the idea that I would get my bishop onto c5 attacking his queen, the queen would move, and then my bishop would come to d6 attacking his rook. I thought this was how I was going to weaken his c file. But the problem is, as soon as I made this move, my bottom dropped out of my stomach, because I realized, of course, that he could play d4 here. And this is, just bad for white. I mean, he's attacking my queen, and he's forking my two pieces. What am I going to do? And I actually went for a stroll away from the board because I didn't want to show my distress. But when I came back and looked at it a bit, I realized that I could get away with losing the exchange for a pawn. That is, trade my rook for the bishop and a pawn, which is not great coming from a position where I had a winning advantage, but it doesn't mean that I'm losing right away either. So the way to do that, of course, would have been to sack the exchange with my rook so that his bishop can't take my queen. He takes back, I take his rook, and he's better off if he takes with his pawn here than with the rook, because otherwise I can check with my queen and snap up the d pawn. So he takes with the pawn, so I'm forced to take the pawn not with my queen and not exploit that diagonal. Anyhow, I could have had this position, and Mike actually looked at in his mind. He said after the game that he also analyzed this line, and he just didn't like the feel of this position. He was a little too worried about my knight in the center and my protected passed pawn here on e5. But it's really, the position is better for black, and this is what he should have gone into. And what he did instead, back in this position after I played my knight back to b3, was basically an error. It was to play his queen into b4, trying to infiltrate my position, get the queen over to e4 on the next move here, is his idea. And I make sure he has to do that by attacking it with my bishop. Now he's really has no choice. And he goes over to e4, and instead of trading off and giving him a protected passed pawn, I retreat my queen. And now his queen is in danger of being trapped. And he really had to do something about that. He could push this g-pawn to attack this guy a second time so that his queen could take here. Or he could play bishop to h6 to attack it a second time. I can't defend with a pawn, unfortunately, because it's pinned. The queen is pinning that pawn to my king. So he could have survived okay by doing that. He didn't do that. Instead, he went to work on my queen side, trying to attack my knight, which is one of the defenders of my bishop. But this doesn't work for him because I just go after the trapped queen. And now he's really got nothing better than to play queen takes pawn, in which case I would take it back. He can take my knight, and if I recapture with the pawn, then he still wins my bishop. but I can trade off a pair of bishops. And now I get into this nice endgame of queen against a rook and a bishop. And let's see, 6 pawns against 6. Yeah, the pawns are equal. So queen against rook and bishop. This is, and with that passed e-pawn, that's going to be able to travel pretty easily for the touchdown. This is definitely better for black than the game continuation, but it's still pretty easily lost. Instead of that, he played kind of a more speculative move, d4, but I just go ahead and take his queen. He takes my rook. So after he takes the first rook, I get my rook, which is on out of pre, and take his bishop with it. So now the material balance is getting horribly in White's favor. He plays pawn takes pawn. With vague ideas of somehow getting it down to the first rank, but I just take the pawn. And in this position where he is down, let's see, a rook and a bishop. So I have a queen and a knight in return for his rook. With that material deficit, he threw in the towel. So it was a fun game, and for me, it was a little tough for Mike, but he could have, if he had played a little differently when I made that very bad move of my knight to b3. If he'd just gone ahead and pushed the d pawn at this point, then I would have been a hurting turkey, and I was lucky to escape this one. So I've got 2-0, and I was on board 2 this week. I'll be playing somebody else with 2-0 next week, and bring you the action from that. So long.